Obama's dilemma in Syria. The US president insists ISIL must be defeated, but says the same about the Assad government that ISIL is fighting. So what are the options of the US president now his air forces are actively engaged over Syrian soil? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to another edition of Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna. After months of hesitation about whether to intervene in the war in Syria, the US is now deeply involved. But the target isn't President Bashar al-Assad, it's the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. ISIL's command and control infrastructure, as well as its oil facilities, have been targeted, dealing a blow to the group's economic lifeline. But the assault on ISIL raises larger questions over the involvement of international actors in the Syrian conflict. ISIL has been battling the Syrian army, as have multiple opposition groups representing the 2011 revolution. Some of those groups have been supported by Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar. Now the Syrian government and those who are against it are in some ways on the same page, fighting ISIL. And this raises some important questions. The US government says it's focused on dealing with ISIL militarily and politically.
We're responsible for applying military pressure on them, but there's no way that this group is going to be defeated just solely through air power or even military power alone. So we are very cognizant here in the Pentagon of our role, and it's one piece of a larger strategy that has to be executed not just by a whole of government here in the United States, but by the international communities.
So what choices does the US government have in Syria? President Obama has said the US will not work with Bashar al-Assad's government. He's also ruled out sending any ground troops, leaving the fight to opposition groups already in the country. This raises questions about supporting groups affiliated with al-Qaeda, such as al-Nusra Front, that are fighting the Assad government and ISIL. The US and its allies say they will instead arm so-called moderate opposition groups. The problem is that these groups have proven largely ineffective against Assad. Well, to untangle this messy situation, we are joined by Mark Kimmett in Washington, D.C. He's a former US Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. From Moscow, Vyacheslav Matuzov, a former Russian diplomat and chairman of the Russian Friendship Society with Arab countries. And in Doha, Maran Kabalan, Syrian writer and political analyst at the Doha Institute Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Mark Kimmett in Washington. Was it the right decision by President Obama to take the struggle against ISIL inside Syria?
Oh, I think it was essential that we had to go inside Syria. As long as Syria provided safe haven, sanctuary, and a logistics base for ISIL, there was no way that the forces inside of Iraq could be completely destroyed. You had to go against their logistics base. You had to go against where they took sanctuary. Otherwise, you couldn't remove ISIL from the region.
Well, Vyacheslav Matuzov, your view, do you think that Obama was correct to go inside Syria?
I think that principally he's correct, because fighting ISIL, it is very necessary business today for all of us, for the United States, for Russia, for Arab states. But I think that the form performing his readiness to strike on ISIL is not acceptable from the Russian point of view. First of all, that coalition that he is formating right now and that participating in air strikes on ISIL positions is not correct from Russian point of view. Why? That it is a dangerous thing to intervene to another country without permission on local government, because not only judicial side, but a common moral side and military side, We know from the experiments in Afghanistan and Pakistan, it's very difficult to find only military targets in any place, or civil targets. And all the time it will be civil people will suffer. I think that if responsibility for suffering civil stuff in Syria will be only on American responsibility, it is wrong position, because it should be shared with local authorities, with Syrian government. And we saw that there are suspicions only in Russia, in many circles here, that the United States didn't change their intention to blow up the situation against Syrian regime.
Well,
Russia,
we'll go. There's a lot of issues that you bring up there, Vyacheslav Matuzov, in particular the coalition that you mentioned. But first of all, let's go to Marwan Kabalan there. And just to pick up what was just mentioned there, Russia has been absolutely opposed to any outside involvement in the affairs of Syria. This, as we are hearing there, is seen very much as against the interests of the Syrian people. Your view?
I think if we are talking about foreign interference in the Syrian crisis, this has been a war by proxy for some time now. I mean, the American intervention is just a manifestation, a new manifestation of how this crisis has developed into regional and international conflict, because we all know that starting in early 2012, that the Syrian conflict has become war by proxy between two opposite camps here. We are talking about the United States, Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, and Turkey on one hand, and we are talking about Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and the Syrian regime on the other hand. And these two camps have been fighting their own conflict, actually, on Syrian soil with Syrian blood. And I feel like it's the very policy of President Obama and also of Russia that has led us to where we are now, having ISIL controlling huge parts of both Syria and Iraq, because we all know that President Obama has been so reluctant to intervene in the Syrian conflict from the very beginning, and he just wanted to forget about Syria. He just wanted to neglect Syria. He just did not want to do anything about Syria. The Russians also, they did not really cooperate on the Geneva conference with the Americans in order to bring a political solution to this crisis. So I think it's the responsibility of the great powers in the first place that have led us actually to the situation that we are having right now in Syria. The country has been literally destroyed by this war, and I think unless they do something very quick, I think we are going to lose what has remained of Syria.
Mark Kimmett, the situation is very, very complicated now. You made the point about the necessity to combat ISIL in its home turf, so to speak. Yet in doing so, it's fractured an already deeply divided Syrian opposition, has it not?
In some way it has. I've got to add, I find the Russian guest's comments quite humorous. If Russia was to apply those same standards to their activities inside of Ukraine that they're asking the United States to apply inside of Syria, I could take the argument more seriously. But you're absolutely right. The fact remains that there are rebel forces inside of Syria, moderate rebel forces that the United States believes can lead towards a path towards change inside of Iraq, not the extremist rebels that they are fighting, such as ISIL. And again, as long as you've got a dictator inside of Damascus that they're fighting against, who is openly funded and supported by both Iran and Russia, this is going to continue to be that very complicated situation that you're talking about. The necessity of going against ISIL in and of itself and the Khorasan group was an imperative of the United States simply for the needs of America alone. Frankly, Syria is a byproduct of that, but not the direct activity. The fact that Syria has become a sanctuary and safe haven for these types of al-Qaeda type activities and al-Qaeda proxy activities made it imperative for our national security that we go in to destroy them. And to suggest that this is simply an American operation, the fact is that 60 countries in the world have joined the United States in this fight because they recognize the threat that ISIL presents to their countries as well.
That point is well taken. It is a wide-ranging coalition at this particular point. But Vyacheslav Matuzov, I want to pick up on something that you mentioned. You mentioned Afghanistan, for example, the difficulties of fighting what is effectively a guerrilla war in another country, in another sovereign country. Is this something you believe that is a constant threat to the success of the US-led operation in Syria?
Well, I think that airstrikes doesn't solve the issue. If you know that airstrikes can be supportive efforts to win the war, but war is won by ground forces. Where is ground forces? The United States are considering Syrian Free Army as a main point that they were now supporting it and trying to push it against ICO. But it is obviously that all military assistance that the United States are sending to Syrian Free Army will be tomorrow in the hand of Jabhat al-Nusra, Ahrar al-Sham, or ICO. It's their field commanders, not those opposition leaders that are spread between Washington, London, and Paris. I think that Turkish position right now, it shows very well they're cautious about the situation in Iraq and Syria. I think that they don't want to cut their relations, traditional relations with ICO. That we have known that there are bases for medical assistance to ICO fighters in Turkish territory. So when we put everything together, I can also say that we cannot compare Ukraine's situation. I think that propaganda of Ukrainian and American propaganda on this issue showed very clear that Russian involvement in military involvement in Ukraine, that's wrong. Russia didn't have involved in Ukrainian.
Well, I respect your right, Vyacheslav, to actually respond to Mark Emmett's comment there, but we'll keep it focused on the situation in Syria at this particular point. And Marwan Kabalan, I want to come to you with that issue of the US saying, nope, no forces on the ground, that we will use and support the forces that are fighting against Assad on the one side, and will also now fight, it is assumed by the US, against ISIL. Is there something wrong with that assumption?
Well, I think President Obama has a few weeks ago said, he admitted actually, that he doesn't have a solid strategy for to deal with this conflict. And because of the domestic pressure on him, he actually decided to have a strategy suddenly out of the blue and to assemble all these allies all together to establish this international coalition, mainly with the Arab Sunni countries, in order not to be seen as if he was actually siding with Shiite forces, with Iran against a Sunni organization. And I think we all recognize the fact that Air Force will not solve this problem. And the Americans, they know this very well. Everybody else does. So let's not be very sure that President Obama, who was very reluctant from the very beginning to do anything about Syria and to do anything about Iraq, because President Obama, we all know that he knew for sure that al-Maliki was actually pursuing a very sectarian policies that led to actually alienating the Sunnis in Iraq and to having them actually siding with ISIL and supporting ISIL. So now, I'm afraid that Obama, at some point in the future, will have to send troops on the ground in Syria and Iraq, because today we all know that the Iraqi army cannot actually stand up and fight ISIL, even with this air strikes by the United States. There are many reports now everywhere on the media that the Iraqi army is very much divided, very much corrupted. They lack all the necessary training in order to defeat ISIL. In Syria, the situation is even much worse for President Obama. So I know that he will come up and say, we will not send troops on the ground because I came to power in 2009 promising that we will not be actually get involved in any new war or military action in the Middle East. But now we are seeing him getting involved in Syria, in Iraq, and I'm afraid sometime in the future we'll see him actually sending troops on the ground because it doesn't work for him. It wouldn't work for him. Well, mainly by airstrikes.
We've been talking about the coalition. Let's just pause here because the Obama administration has also asked Saudi Arabia to help out with the issue, to help form and to help arm moderate groups who are within Syria. Now, Mark Kimmett, those particular moderate groups that are being referred to, there was a specific request made to Saudi Arabia. Some of them have seen them as incredibly ineffective, but others, groups that have been backed by Saudi Arabia, do have a closeness to groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra, or indeed to elements of ISIL. Is this not an issue that could disrupt the entire process?
Oh, I think this is not only the long pole in the tent, but could well be the fatal flaw in this strategy. Depending upon the rebel forces to provide the ground element of the fight against Assad is a pretty weak leg to stand on. In fact, I think we're going to see a situation in the long run where you may have a middle ground. Assad staying in power in a rump Syria and the northeastern part of the country under rebel control, and the United States and its coalition partners flying a no-fly zone up there to keep Assad's forces out. It may end up looking very similar to what Iraq looked like from 1991 to 2002, where neither Saddam was ejected, but the Kurds and the Shia were protected by Operation Northern Watch and Operation Southern Watch.
Well, Vyacheslav Matuzov, the situation that is emerging at present is that you have Bashar al-Assad having pulled his army back to protect Damascus, to also secure the western coastline. He's essentially left the north to its own devices. The situation you now have are northern groups that had at one stage been fighting against the Assad government, now fighting against each other, a fight that will be accentuated by this US-led engagement against ISIL, is it not? The end result is that Bashar al-Assad takes a breath.
Yes, of course. This situation that now in the northeast of Syria is favorable for Syrian army because they are fighting each other, because United States air forces are striking blows to positions of ISIL. That's okay, but we have one very important thing, that tomorrow it will be different situation. Today it is modus vivendi between Syrian and American in Syria situation. I know that Syrian government didn't reject the idea of airstrikes, American airstrikes to northern against the ISIL, but in spite of the fact that the United States Army rejected the idea of coordination of any military operations between Syrian and American army. I think that Syria will humiliate all these things up to the moment when it will be obvious that American strikes are against Syrian army. As we understand that the final target of all operation of United States and their coalition forces is not ISIL, but Syrian regime. The first thing, I think that if it will be changed, the mind, and will be directed to Syrian regime, I think that Russia will change their attitude, Syrian government change its attitude. I think that the resistance from both will be more serious than we watch now.
Well,
today,
I'd like to go to Mark Kimmett on that particular point. I'll come to Marwan in a moment. But Mark Kimmett, I'd like you to respond to that assertion that there is actually the accusation that something else lies behind this. The target is not ISIL, the eventual target. This is an excuse, as what we've heard, the argument there, to actually end up with armed action against the Assad regime. What's your belief of that analysis?
Well, the U.S. policy still remains Assad must go. Much like a World War II analogy where we decided as allies to go to Germany first, Japan second, I think the immediate effort is to go against ISIL. I don't think the U.S. policy has changed that Assad must go. Now, my view is I think that that may be a bridge too far for the coalition. They will stay focused on ISIL and ISIL alone. And as I said earlier, we may find ourselves 2 years from now in a situation where you've got a generally neutered northeast area, which is resplendent with some rebels, and a rump Syria with Assad still in place. Because I think the last thing people want to see is that removing Assad results in a rebel-held Damascus and a rebel-held Syria that resembles Libya.
Well, Marwan Kabalan, that's a gloomy prognosis that you just heard, a kind of rump Syria, a de facto division of the country.
Absolutely. But I think, I mean, it can't be like Iraq, because this is, I mean, this is a very different case in Syria. The west and the coastal area in Syria, they can't live without the east and the northeast. Why? Because we have most of our natural resources actually are located there. The oil, I mean, this is where it's the farm of the country where most people actually eat from the east and the northeast. So I don't think how that is going to, play out in Syria, but this is absolutely very, very dangerous, idea for a Syrian to hear. I think what Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, said yesterday was very interesting and very important. That of course you can kill a few terrorists by military strikes, but if you want to kill terrorism, you have to have a political solution. So we have to have a political solution for this conflict. Otherwise, we will continue actually to breed more and more terrorists. Just a few years ago, when the United States left Iraq in 2011, Al-Qaeda was almost dead in Iraq. And because of the Syrian conflict, because of the neglect of the Syrian conflict, now we see ISIL coming back, making this comeback, making this a very strong
But also
comeback.
because of the situation within Iraq. You mentioned yourself the anger in Iraq among Sunni groups.
So if you don't have a political solution to this problem, the no-fly zone in Syria and the north and northeast will not solve the problem. It will, it will be there all the time. So I think we have to go for a political solution to this crisis, not for dividing the country.
Mark Kimmett, is there any possibility of a political solution in a scenario where you have various rebel groups fighting each other, fighting against the Assad regime, and now being helped by all sorts of parties, including a number of Arab states in the US-led coalition, all of whom are Sunni states?
Yeah, actually, I think that we're not far from agreement here. I believe that by having a no-fly zone in the northeast, where Assad is not able to fly his aircraft and drop their barrel bombs, but yet you still have Assad in power in Damascus, recognizing that the worst possible solution would be a partitioned country, the fact that if you can inject some stability into the northeast and into the rest of the country, that may be the precondition for the political solution so that Syria can remain an integral nation, so that once the security situation has been mitigated, you can get on to that political resolution that your other guest was recommending. I believe that we ought to have a Syria whole. I think we ought to have a Syria that integrates all communities and doesn't exclude any communities, and one that is self-sufficient. But I don't think we get there until we have that political solution, and I don't think we have that political solution until we get a stabilized military situation inside the country.
Marwan Kabalan, very quickly, is there a possibility of any form of stability whatsoever in a situation that has now almost had dynamite thrown into the water?
Of course, and especially now, as I said before, Syria, this is no longer a Syrian conflict. This is a regional and international conflict. As long as we have all these parties fighting their own war on Syrian soil, we are not going to have this stability, because no one side will allow the other actually to win this conflict. This is why we have been talking all the time about a political solution. But in order to have that political solution, we have to have understanding between the great powers, between the regional powers, and between the Syrian forces on the ground. That is the recipe for a political solution.
Well, a very complex situation, and thanks to my guests for helping us with it. Mark Kimmett, Vyacheslav Mutuzov, and Marwan Kabalan. And thank you for watching. Do please feel free to add your voice to this discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. Look for @AJ Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna. From me and all the team, goodbye for now.